Chapter 12, The Cup of Suffering. Unlike his return from Indonesia, when Andrew got home from Poland to St. Pancras, this time everyone in the village wanted to hear about his experiences. This was a pleasant surprise, and within a week of arriving back, Andrew had talked at several house meetings in the village about all the things he had heard, seen, and done while in Warsaw. Soon, invitations began arriving from as far away as Amsterdam for him to come and talk about the suffering church behind the Iron Curtain. Andrew protested that he was not any kind of expert on the subject, but Christians were eager to hear what he had to say anyway. After all, they told him he had seen and heard much more than they had. Andrew's family was also supportive of him. In the time he had been away at the WEC training school, his family had built above the garden shed another room, which Mr. Vanderbiel had moved into. The room Andrew's father had vacated was the biggest room in the house. It had always been a bedroom, and Andrew assumed that his sister Geltie and her husband Ari would want it. But they did not. Instead, they told Andrew that he should move into the room. They had decided that he could use it only as his bedroom, but also as the headquarters for his ministry. Andrew was humbled by Geltie and Ari's gesture. He was also a little concerned. It seemed to him that everyone else thought that he knew what he was going to do with his life. After all, he had speaking engagements and a headquarters, and he had been asked to write a series of magazine articles on communism and Christianity, and all of this because he had gone to Poland for 3 weeks to attend a youth festival. Other people might have confidence that he knew where he was headed, but the truth was, Andrew had no real idea what God wanted him to do next. He was sure that God had spoken to him during his last day in Warsaw, but since he had no idea how this calling might work out, Andrew decided he should just keep taking the next opportunity that presented itself and pray that God would show him the way. And that is what happened, though not in a way that Andrew could have predicted. Just as he finished speaking to a large crowd in Amsterdam, a stout woman made a beeline toward him. Andrew recognized the woman instantly. She had led the Dutch contingent to the youth festival in Warsaw. She planted herself firmly in front of him and got straight to the point. "I don't approve of what you said tonight," she announced. "I didn't think you would," Andrew replied. "You emphasized the things in post-revolutionary countries that we communists are still trying to change. You should look to the future and realize that we offer many advantages for today's youth," the woman said. "I only spoke about what I saw with my own eyes and the experiences I had," Andrew shrugged. The woman pounced on this statement. "That is the point. You need to see more so that you will be able to speak more positively. I am in charge of organizing a group of 15 people for a fact-finding trip into Czechoslovakia. We'll be gone for a month. We have educators and communicators, and we need someone with a church perspective. Would you like to come?" Andrew shook his head. He barely had enough money for the bus fare home to St. Pancras, let alone enough for a second trip behind the Iron Curtain. "I don't have the money," he replied. The woman looked him up and down with a shrewd look on her face. "I'll work out the money. If you want to come, say so," she snapped. Andrew looked at her. Was she really offering him a free trip to Czechoslovakia? "And you'll deal with the visas?" he asked. "Everything is already taken care of. What do you say? Are you coming?" "When do we leave?" Andrew smiled. As he rode home on the bus that night, Andrew could hardly believe what had just taken place. He was off on a second trip behind the Iron Curtain. Was this just a coincidence, or was God up to something big? As he rode home on the bus that night, Andrew could hardly believe what had just taken place. He was off on a second trip behind the Iron Curtain. Was this just a coincidence, or was God up to something big? On a cold November morning, 3 months after his visit to Warsaw, Andrew found himself standing in Prague, rain pouring down as he listened to their tour guide explaining about yet another wonderful achievement of communism. He had been in Czechoslovakia for 3 weeks now, and every day had followed much the same pattern. Andrew and the 14 other members of the party were herded from one staged event to another, while their tour guide expounded on the virtues of communism and pointed out how much freer the Czech people were now than they had never been in the past. Andrew doubted this, but it was hard to find any evidence to disprove it. The tour leader, the stout Dutch woman who had recruited Andrew for the trip, kept a particularly sharp eye on him, making sure that he was usually at the front of the group. He counted to make sure that everyone was present and accounted for at least once an hour. She said that it was to make sure no one got lost, but Andrew was convinced that she was worried about his going off and exploring Prague alone. He wished he could, but he did not see how he could do it. In the meantime, the tour guide offered Andrew an official look at the harmonious cooperation between the church and the government. The government does not wish to interfere with religious beliefs, she told him. In fact, it has an entire facility dedicated to producing a new and improved version of the Bible. Would you like to visit it? Of course, Andrew replied. The next day, Andrew and the tour guide set out for the center of Prague to a large office building called the Interchurch Center. The guide explained that the building was the center for all the Protestant churches in the country. Inside the building, Andrew and the guide wound their way through a maze of gloomy corridors until they came to a large room. Inside sat a number of scholars clad in black coats, some of them almost hidden by the piles of papers and books stacked on their desks. Andrew spoke to one of the scholars in German. "May I see the new translation?" he asked. The scholar got up and walked to another desk. He returned moments later. Andrew had expected to be handed a bound copy of the new Bible, but instead the scholar handed him a typed manuscript, its pages dog-eared from constant handling. "The translation hasn't been published yet?" Andrew asked. "No, not yet," the scholar replied, and Andrew noted the sadness in his eyes as he answered. "We've had the translation finished since the war, but—" "The scholars are now working on a Bible dictionary," the tour guide interrupted. Sheepishly, the scholar looked at the tour guide and then down at his desk. "Is the Bible dictionary ready yet?" Andrew asked. "Almost," the scholar replied. "But what good will a Bible dictionary do if there are no Bibles? Are there earlier translations of the Bible available?" Andrew shot back. The Bible scholar was silent for a moment, and then quickly he blurted, "No, it is difficult, very difficult to find Bibles in Czechoslovakia these days." With that, the tour guide ended the visit and led Andrew out of the Interchurch Center building. Andrew was very quiet at dinner that night. He was thinking about how shrewd the communists were. Instead of openly banning the Bible, they had announced that they were producing a better version. But that better version would never be published. As he thought about it, Andrew became frustrated. Tomorrow, Sunday, would be his last full day in Czechoslovakia, and he had not yet been able to find a way to talk privately with any Christians. He decided that one way or another, he was going to find a way to do just that. The following morning, the group set out on yet another bus tour of important revolutionary sites. Predictably, the tour guide had the bus stop at each site while she explained why the particular place had played such an important role in the communist takeover of the country. By the second stop, Andrew had managed to position himself at the very back of the bus, desperately looking for some way to escape from the group. As he sat in the back, his eyes rested on the rear door. To his left, the door had a faulty hinge, which left about a 12-inch gap at the side when it was closed. 12 inches. Andrew sucked in his breath. Could he squeeze through a 12-inch gap? Yes, he was sure he could. He sat patiently at the back of the tour bus as the tour bus drove on. At each intersection, he waited for the gaze of everyone to be directed toward the front, but there was always someone looking at a sight to the rear. Then, finally, the bus pulled up to a bronze statue of a man on horseback. The tour guide launched into an impassioned speech about the statue's significance. Everyone peered at the statue, everyone, that is, except Andrew, who saw his chance, slipped quietly from his seat, and moved toward the faulty door. Andrew took one last look at his fellow passengers, who were all listening intently to the tour guide. He let out his breath and squeezed through the gap in the door. He felt the road beneath his feet and managed to pull the rest of his body through the opening just before the bus belched a plume of blue exhaust smoke and drove on. For the first time on the tour, Andrew was alone in Czechoslovakia. He looked around. He was sure that he had seen a church nearby on a previous bus tour through this part of the city. He reasoned that it was probably to the east, and he set out walking in that direction. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, he was seated in the back row of a church. As the congregation stood to sing a hymn, Andrew noticed something interesting that made him wonder whether everyone in the building was far-sighted. Those people with hymnals were holding them up high at arm's length. Other people were doing the same with notebooks. After a few minutes, Andrew figured out that the people weren't all far-sighted after all. Because hymnals were in such short supply, whoever was lucky enough to own one held it in such a way that as many people as possible could see the words to the hymns. Also on the pages of the notebooks held aloft, people had copied the words of the hymns by hand, and when the pastor quoted the Bible references during a sermon, the few people who owned Bibles held them up in the same way for people to see. Andrew suddenly realized how precious the small Dutch Bible in his pocket was, and how precious the freedom to own one at will. At the end of the service, Andrew shook the pastor's hand and said quietly, "Brother, I am a believer from Holland. I'm here to meet with Christians in your country." "Please come and talk with me, brother. You are the first believer we have met from the West in many years," the pastor said. A short while later, Andrew was seated in the pastor's apartment, sipping coffee and listening to what the pastor had to say. "Things here are difficult. The government is trying to gain a stranglehold on the church. They are even choosing the theological students. Only those who support the regime are allowed to study theology. And as a pastor, I have to renew my license every 2 months. All pastors must do this, and recently a friend of mine had his request for a renewal turned down." The government did not tell him why. They don't have to. The pastor drank a mouthful of coffee and then continued. "And even with a license, we are not free to preach what we wish. We must write out each sermon ahead of time and have it approved by the government before we can preach it." Andrew did not quite know how to respond to this information. He just let out a gentle whistle. "We are going to have another service soon, brother. I would like you to come and speak to us," the pastor said. "But I thought sermons had to be approved ahead of time," Andrew inquired. "I'm not asking you to preach," the pastor said with a twinkle in his eye. "I want you to bring us greetings from the Christians in your country, and if you wish, you could also bring us greetings from the Lord Jesus." And that is what Andrew did. With the help of a young medical student named Antonin, who served as his translator, Andrew gave the people a brief greeting from the Christians in Holland and the West. Then he spent the next 30 minutes giving the people greetings from Jesus Christ. Those in the congregation so appreciated his words that they gathered around to shake his hand at the end of the service. This approach was so successful that Andrew and Antonin spent the rest of the afternoon presenting greetings to 4 other Czech churches. The final church they visited was a Moravian church on the other side of Prague. About 100 people were gathered in the sanctuary, and Andrew was surprised that about 40 of these were young people between the ages of 18 and 25. At the end of this service, after Andrew had presented his greetings, a number of the young people gathered around Andrew and peppered him with questions. They found it hard to believe that Christians in Holland and the West were not penalized for being Christians. They explained that to be a Christian in Czechoslovakia meant being treated like a second-class citizen. The Czech government would not allow Christians to hold good jobs or attend university. For these young people, being a Christian meant having to endure a good deal of suffering. As the conversation was winding down, one of the Moravians handed Antonin a silver lapel pin. "They want you to have this as a gift of remembrance," Antonin explained to Andrew. Andrew looked at the lapel pin, which was in the shape of a small cup. "What does the cup signify?" he asked. "It is the symbol of the church in Czechoslovakia," Antonin said, attaching the pin to the lapel of Andrew's jacket. "We call it the cup of suffering." One of the young Moravians then said something, and Antonin translated his words. "Now you are a partaker of the cup with us. When the people of Holland ask you about the cup, tell them about the Czech Christians. Remind them that we too are part of the body of Christ. Tell them that we are in pain, that we are suffering." Darkness had descended over Prague by the time Andrew said goodbye to Antonin and headed off to find the tour group. He wondered how the members of the group would have taken his disappearance. Surely, he told himself, nothing too bad could happen as a result of it. When he got back to the hotel, the group was not there, nor were they at the restaurant, where they had eaten most nights. Andrew ordered a sandwich there anyway, and he had just taken his first bite when the tour leader, the stout Dutch woman, strode into the room. Her face was bright red, and she kept her mouth firmly shut. She motioned for Andrew to follow her. Andrew got up from the table and followed her out the front door of the restaurant and into a waiting limousine. Not a word passed between them, and Andrew supposed she was too angry with him to speak. He was right. Then, just before they arrived back at the hotel, the woman could hold her peace no longer. "You have held us all up for half a day. We have looked everywhere for you, in all the hospitals, the police stations, even the morgue. And now I find you calmly eating a sandwich? Where have you been?" she exploded. Andrew stuck his hands in his pockets so that she would not see him shaking. "Oh," he said as lightly as he could, "I got separated from you, so I decided to do a bit of exploring on my own. I had no idea I would cause this much trouble. I apologize." "That's not enough," the woman snapped back. "You are officially unwelcome here ever again. I am sorry I brought you along on this trip. If you ever try to come back to this country, you will find your way blocked at the border. I will personally see to it." Andrew stared out the window of the limousine. Had he gone astray somehow, or was this all part of God's plan? He did not know.